Welcome to Indefinable Magic. Normally a pre-written monologue full of thoughts and observations about a particular aspect of the television series Doctor Who. This time, though, we've gone for something slightly different, for reasons that will hopefully become apparent, and will definitely be over-explained. Tonight's episode, Race and Time. Presented by me, Toby Haydoke, with a special guest, Tom Attah. Hello everybody, thank you for listening. Regular punters will know that Indefinable Magic is usually a monologue, conceived to examine, in a way that is hopefully interesting, thought-provoking, and mildly amusing at times, or I hope, some particular aspect of the television series Doctor Who. The announcement of Ncuti Gatwa's casting as the Doctor, and the various reactions to it in different corners of the media, both mainstream and social, prompted me to examine race and representation in Doctor Who over the years, right up to the current state of play, which has culminated in the very first time the series' lead actor has been a person of colour. It's a complex, divisive issue, and one that, even when laying out the groundwork for the approach and subject matter of a humble podcast discussing it, requires careful phraseology and contextualising subclauses. Discussion these days is often a bad faith minefield, where identity and semantics can be weaponised by both sides in order to divert us from discussing the complexities like grown-ups. Which all then requires me to indulge in a turgid series of justifications and qualifications, that's what all this is, by the way, in order to head off any anticipated criticisms of what I'm about to do. Such is life in the 21st century. What I'm not about to do is a monologue. I tried writing one. It had some good jokes in it, at the expense of the idea that the casting of a BAFTA nominee as the chameleon-like face-changing alien hero of time and space is evidence that somehow the liberal, and to use the descriptor du jour, woke elite has somehow ruined Doctor Who with the application of some kind of agenda. But I also tried to contextualise this, to examine the idea that our modern-day difficulties with the paucity of representation in, say, old stories from classic Doctor Who, are too often steeped in a lack of context themselves, and a worrying desire on the modern-day commentator to scold the past for indiscretions in a way that would make Judge Danforth in Arthur Miller's The Crucible seem like a paragon of equivocation. But bringing nuance to discussions these days, well, it's a risky business. And yet, I, too, have to be open to the idea that me, a middle-aged, middle-class white guy, extemporising for an hour about race relations in the United Kingdom right now, well, I might not be the best qualified to take centre stage, even in my own podcast. So even though I know I come from a liberal, well-meaning perspective, as a voter, I would vote for a candidate who is not racist, or, even better, actively anti-racist. When I was younger, we didn't buy South African produce as a protest against apartheid. And to coin a cliché, some of my best friends are black. However, I might still have inbuilt prejudices, or misconceptions, or I might adopt positions actually based on ignorance. And all of that might well need examining. But also, much as I dislike racism, I'm acutely aware that in our current discourse, accusations of racism against others are sometimes flung out glibly, dishonestly, or inaccurately. Now, do I think that is worse than racism itself? Maybe not. Do I think it helps? Definitely not. And in a discussion like this, uncomfortable truths need airing. And because this is a discussion involving just two people, Muggins here is the airer, the messenger, and you all hopefully know how wrong it is to shoot that guy. And this is what this is. It's an examination, a discussion, a forum of ideas. I'm taking the role of the question master. I will often play devil's advocate, even if I personalise some of the questions, or I say, I think. It may not be exactly what I think, but it's a way of making the discussion human, organic, and flowing. I say all of this because the least interesting response to this podcast will be people getting back to me saying, well, you only asked that because this, that, or the other about me. Or you would say that because this, that, or the other about me. Or, hang on, here is the least generous interpretation I can make of a minor piece of phraseology that you have framed a particular section of a particular argument in, and I shall now proceed to railroad you with that forever. Because hopefully, I'm the least interesting part of anything that happens in this broadcast. I'm honestly and openly trying to get understanding, to offer perspective, and to sometimes challenge. I have a guest who is obviously more clued up on some of these issues, all of these issues, than I. But to get to the truth, I have a duty to sometimes push back, to postulate, and to challenge. I don't do that with what Toby Haydock thinks. And to be honest, sometimes even I am not sure what Toby Haydock thinks. And sometimes Toby Haydock thinks on a Tuesday something very different to what Toby Haydock thinks on a Wednesday. No, I do it because in an increasingly fractured, binary and sometimes toxic environment for debate, my preference is for adult conversations based on ideas, theories, and the batting forth of thoughts and arguments in a sober, non-judgmental way, crucially held in good faith by all parties, including the listener, in order to negotiate our way through something important, but perhaps impossible to quantify or measure. Worth talking about, though. And with that in mind, let's meet someone who is going to guide us through this tricky landscape, which we are negotiating, he and I, with mutual respect and a generosity of spirit. And so, please bestow yours upon us. I think to begin, I have to ask you to introduce yourself and tell me all about yourself.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so yes, my name is Tom Attah. My official title is Professor Tom Attah. I'm a popular music academic. I work in the north of England, and I've been a Doctor Who fan since, I'd say, 1970. You can correct me here, 1977, because the first memory I've got is the Nestine, the Nestine consciousness materializing as a giant prawn. Now I've been back since and backfilled all of that, but my first real-time memory was watching that bit of the Invisible Enemy.
The nucleus, not the Nestine. Yes, the
nucleus of the swarm.
Well, how funny, Tom, because the Invisible Enemy is also my first memory of Doctor Who. Isn't that an amusing coincidence?
Well, we're the right people to be having this conversation. I should also say, because it may not be obvious from my voice, that I'm also black. I'm a man of color, and so part of my engagement with Doctor Who is not defined by that, but it's part of who I am. It's part of my identity. So even when I was younger, I remember thinking, oh, there's a curly-haired guy called Tom, i.e. Tom Baker, who is Doctor Who, and in the way that a child would confuse those things, that seemed to be something I was very fond of and something I gravitated towards.
So that's very helpful for us that we've had the same sort of chronological factors affecting our digestion of Doctor Who. So we are talking today in the wake of, I suppose it started off, didn't it, in the wake of Ncuti Gatwa's casting and conversations that were prompted by that event, to talk about race and representation in Doctor Who was the all-encompassing sort of heading we wanted to give that. So how do we couch this? What are we talking about when we talk about representation, and why are we having this conversation, Tom?
Okay, to me, we're having the conversation because Ncuti Gatwa has been cast as the Doctor. So this is a hugely high-profile character. The Doctor is, I would say, at the centre of, is definitely a part of culture in the modern day. And to see a man of colour cast for the first time, as the Doctor, which of course, let's not forget the fugitive Doctor. Let's not as well. But to see Ncuti Gatwa occupying the central role is a matter, I think, of some significance, or at least I regard it as a matter of some significance. And it seems to be something that commentators have spoken about. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about the way that race, and we'll go on to define race, and representation have played a part in this amazing, wonderful show that we know that certainly you and I are so fond of. Because it seems that certainly until the casting of Jodie Whittaker, there were the casting of the central role was actually quite consistent from a certain point of view. And when we see Jodie, we see the first female actor playing Doctor Who, and now we see Ncuti. I think, as I've expressed to you before, I was ecstatic about this because although I've always known I was the Doctor in a certain way, to see the Doctor looking like me is just amazing. And I think that, one of the things I mentioned in that first conversation was that there's been a lot of commentary, but I've not heard any complaints from any black people about this at all.
Part of, and I'll probably mention this in the introduction, which in a timey-wimey way I haven't read yet because we were going to discuss this before I did, and obviously there's lots of contextualization and nuance that needs to be fed into this so that we are digested in good faith. We're definitely having a conversation in good faith.
Oh.
But were you surprised, either presently or not, by the actual reaction to the news?
One of the elements of being a person of colour in the United Kingdom is that there can be few surprises, sometimes to some quite extreme reactions from people. But I'm also part of a multicultural society, and I'm an arts professor, and so generally my experience of issues of race and gender and sexuality is that the young, or at least the people who I'm lucky enough to come into contact with, are working through these issues as just it's part of life. Whilst I can't say that anyone is ever truly cut off, we all aspire to be colorblind. We always all aspire to be, to take people as we find them. There's a challenge to doing that in society. And what I found was, yes, that the responses I saw were as I had expected. Oh, great news. And they were all sent, the positive responses are all and can only be centered around, this is the right actor for the job. And the casting of the Doctor is always about that. This is the right actor for this particular role. And I'm slightly disappointed to see that there are some people who take issue with the fact that Ncuti Gatwa is a man of color. But again, this is what Doctor Who is for. If we look at Ncuti Gatwa's, maybe I'm going a bit too far, a bit too deep, but if we look at his background, here's a man from Rwanda who fled Rwanda, made a success for himself in Scotland, and has now risen to one of the most high-profile roles in society, in media. And he joins a number of brown-skinned people in high visibility positions at this point, which in my mind emphasize the diversity and value and beauty of our current society. But that was always that diversity and that beauty and that power was always a central tenet of Doctor Who's storytelling. Maybe not necessarily in the execution, which we can go on to talk about, but the central part of the central message in Doctor Who was, yeah, we're all different, but we're all pulling in the same direction. We will all be given a chance, and only at the point that you prove that you do not that you are somehow evil or you do not have the other's best interests at heart will anger and containment come into play. Otherwise, aside from that, there are no men, there are no women, there are no different sexualities. There are just people, and there are just experiences of the world. And again, given that basis for what I believe Doctor Who is, to have that, someone like Ncuti Gatwa as the central character, and an aspirational character as well for viewers of the show, is just a victory. I think I said to you before that my own reaction to this was I just wept. It's wonderful. I was like, oh my God, the Doctor looks like me. And not only does he look like me, or not only do they look like me, because that's the truth of it now. Not only does the Doctor look like me, they look like so many other black people, black men, black women, who can see that a Time Lord, one of the most powerful beings in the world, looks like you. You can do this.
So, and I will probably drop in constant reminders that when I ask you a question, and I will be occasionally pushing back because I don't want this to be, even though we've discussed this prior and are on the same wavelength, what I think is not important in this discussion, I am hopefully a facilitator of ideas, and hopefully I'm making us not just. I think it's very easy to demonize the people who might disagree with your view, Tom, and I have to sort of push back with us trying to work out where some of those attitudes come from without just saying anyone that disagrees with you is a bad person, say.
No.
So I will be throwing in questions that, as I say, are not necessarily my point of view. It's called playing devil's advocate. We were allowed to do it in the old days, and I'm wanting it to come back into into discussion. So if you now are saying that having a black actor playing Doctor Who means that you have someone to identify with, are you sympathetic with the idea of, Peter Davison, for example, was hounded off Twitter when he lamented upon the casting of a female Doctor that young men had lost a role model. Is if you can sort of claim a Doctor as your own because there is an element of identification with it. Does that not work both ways, and that people who had previously identified lose that identification? Where does the colour blindness come in, if that makes sense?
That's a great question. Well, I think if we accept the premise of okay, so we have to be very clear that Doctor Who is not a documentary. It is a fantasy TV show. It's a great fantasy TV show. If we accept the premise of Doctor Who, then we accept that the central character will and must change as a response to environmental stresses. But that person must change, as we must all over the course of our lives. And if you identify with as I mentioned before, that my first identification was with Tom Baker. Now, that could be for a number of reasons. That, number one, there weren't that many black faces on TV in the mid 1970s. But I had no problem identifying with this person in terms of who they were in context as the Doctor. I do feel for Peter Davison because I see what he was saying. Although it's a simple statement that he's making, there's a lot of nuance to it. He's not, but he himself knows that in time that character will change again, and perhaps, if we're saying that, well, a man who or a person who we perceive as formerly old can actually become young. Someone that we perceive as male can become female. Someone that comes from one particular and frankly unchanging genetic background for the last 60 years can also change. Then I don't see where the problem is. There isn't really a problem there. If we accept that, okay, but once Doctor Who was Patrick Troughton, then he was Tom Baker, then he was Sylvester McCoy, then he was Jodie Whittaker, now he's Ncuti Gatwa. Then if you don't like, this is one of the joys of Doctor Who. If you don't particularly like any version of the show, all you've got to do is wait for the next one to come along and jump on again. Yeah.
Well, if the next Doctor's not a balding man with an increasing waistline that he can't tackle, I'm calling foul on this, Tom. Because you've beaten me to it, frankly.
Well, yes. Please let the Doctor. Well, it could be argued that the Doctor for the longest time was a middle-aged, middle-class white man.
yeah. It's all where you break it down.
Yeah.
And it's also worth saying that one of the things that draws me to conversations like this is because, as the partner of a disabled person, I probably thought we'd advanced very far in terms of disability representation and our treatment of disabled people in society until you spend some time with somebody who is. And then you go, oh, there's still miles to do. Talking to female friends sometimes when you think of all the great strides that are made in that, and then discovering some of the everyday, for example, I don't know a woman that hasn't been sent a number of dick pics, for example, which I just find that is something that we don't talk about, and yet is something that seems to me such an extraordinary and astonishing thing, but that is obviously not part of my experience. And only when you sort of actively ask those questions do you discover some of this stuff. So, of course, I may pat myself on the back that I live in 21st century Great Britain, where people of colour are represented much more and clearly have far more opportunities than they once had. But I don't live as a person of colour in England, in Great Britain in 2023. And so you must therefore tell me perhaps some of the things that I don't, that aren't readily apparent to me as a person that doesn't experience that life.
Okay, that's a really, again, that's really interesting. So there is a suggestion that I was looking at the Race Against Time mini documentary on the Mutants DVD, and there's a comment in there that says any organization which is founded by men retains a male outlook. And so if you're not male, or if you're not white, if you're not male, then the organization is going to function in the favor of the people who founded it. We can, which is an arguable point, but we don't have to look to we only have to perhaps look across the Atlantic to see what the truth of that may or may not be. So yeah, my experience has been that as a Black child, and others that I've met have confirmed this, so I'll be interested to hear what others think. So yeah, one of the things that certainly I was told as a child growing up in the 70s and 80s, and this is confirmed by other people who I've spoken to about this, is that as a Black child, I was told, listen, you're always going to have to run a bit faster, you're always going to have to jump a bit higher, and you're always going to have to work a bit harder, because you have this color working against you. This is something said to me by parents who loved me and cared about me and wanted me to have a good life and a good future. When I've spoken to other people of color, they've broadly confirmed that that's the truth. Right? You've got to work a bit harder. You've got to, you've got to work a bit harder. You've got to jump a bit higher, because although this is your home, there are those who will seek to use your difference against you. Or perhaps you might have to work slightly, and we still see some of this in society, where if you have a name, if you have a certain type of name, then you might find it hard to access things like bank loans, credit, mortgages, even renting house rentals, and so on and so on. These are not my opinions; these are matters of fact. What I do, but then again, not Doctor Who helps to emphasize this character trait in me, which is to say there is always hope. There can only be progress. In which direction we progress is always up for debate, but there can only be progress from the starting point. This is why I'm pleased to work with the young and to work in education, because again, all of our potential is there. These young people will become older. They will become the people who run the country and live the lives of the British and live the lives of human beings on planet Earth while we're still here. And so, yeah, the experience of being Black is maybe it has been described as it's a kind of secondary self-awareness in the best times. And this is the majority of the time, then there's no awareness to it. I don't wake up every morning and think I'm Black. I wake up in the morning and think, oh God, is that the time? And it's time to go. But there are situations where I have to be aware that actually I am Black. I do look different to these people. And I've made, to be honest with you, I've made a feature of it, which is to say, fine, I'll go and do performance. Yes, I admit that musical performance, like sports performance, is something which is traditionally held up as being one of being a person of color's route towards cultural acceptance. But it's the love of music and it's the love of teaching that's drawn me into these environments. And I'm pleased to say that I've had comments from some of my students who say it's so, even now, it is unusual to see a Black person teaching on a course like this, but not only teaching, but actually running the whole course. This is unusual. And so one of the great conceits of humanity is that, our lifetimes are expansive. They're not, they're very, very short. And to be aware of these ideas being expressed by the young, and when I say young, I mean undergraduates, so, 18 to 25 generally. to see these ideas being expressed by the young, and better than that, to see them playing with these ideas and working through them because they recognize that there is still work to do. As you mentioned about your partner, it's the situation for the disabled is different to what it was 40 years ago. Is it ideal? No. Is there work to do? Yes. And so similarly with, let's not get too far away from Doctor Who. Um, is the situation for black people in the world at this point ideal? No. Is it better than it was? Arguably. Have we still got work to do? Yes. How do we do that work? I'm a teacher, so my view is that we do that work in the minds of the young. We present a situation and we say, okay, play with this. This is what you're inheriting.
Well, and before we go, and we're going to do that in some detail to examine, historical representation, starting with classic Who. As you mentioned the young, I will invoke them too, but from the sort of the other perception is that, and I have an 18-year-old and a 22-year-old, and find them very instructive, and have actually shaken off a lot of our preoccupations rather easily because they mix with more children from diverse backgrounds, etc., etc., etc. at school.
Absolutely.
I'm from Ludlow, Tom, and when I was growing up, there was one black man in Ludlow, and he was called Black Terry. And
well, that's okay, and that's it. There
and
is.
my mother, who's a very progressive and liberal person, I remember telling my brother off for referring to Black Terry as Black Terry, because she said that is divisive, that is othering, etc., etc. And the phone rang one day, and I answered it, and somebody said, "Can I speak to Patrick, please?" And I said, "Yes." "Can I tell him who's calling?" And he said, "Yes, it's Black Terry here." So even Black Terry referred to himself as Black Terry. So things change, and things sometimes by osmosis. But the issue with the young, which I find interesting, especially in terms of looking at classic Who as we're going to, is often the tenor of the conversation is one that couches everything that went before us as wrong and as racist. And you couch this. You used a very interesting phrase when we were we've talked about this and we've planned this quite carefully. You wanted to discuss relativism when we're looking at this issue, because that brings in nuance and context, which is often lost, I would argue, in these conversations. And the young are not immune to this by any stretch of the imagination. Is that fair to say?
I think it's very fair to say one of the elements of being younger and growing up. I mean, I'm saying youth as a relative term. I mean, I'm 50 now, so everyone's younger than me. There's a very tribal element to how we operate in society, and there's a very tribal element to being young as well, which is to say that this is a matter of emotional psychology and emotional psychology, which is to say, over many years and generations, we've learned how to behave as a group, as a pack, to ensure our survival and propagation. However, certain needs have evolved out of the species. So, the need to go and kill a mammoth is no longer there. And apologies to any paleontologists who say humans and mammoths didn't coexist. I'm really sorry, I don't know. But the mammoth becomes figurative and becomes metaphorical, and there is still the need to form a family, the need to form a tribe in order to operate and survive in society. We are social animals in that respect. But what I notice is that the young or younger people, and you can be young whilst you're 70, you can still have a young outlook, are less willing to defer to, I won't say arbitrary, but in the case of race, it is almost arbitrary. To refer to arbitrary tribal markings as being absolute. As I say, the number. I'm so pleased to see the number of trans. I mean, I do wonder about getting too close to virtue signaling and being in a particular way, but I am really just being honest. I'm really pleased to see, certainly on my own course, the number of trans students increasing, because they're not. Trans change. We all change. We can all, we all embrace our identity, and to see people with we talk about courage, the courage to come forward, the courage to be who you are. Then, okay, to me, these are wonderful things. I do feel rather that I've lost the thread of your original question a little.
Well, we're talking about relativism, which is, I guess, the context in which these events happen.
Yeah. So we need to get the definition in here. So relativism, cultural relativism, moral relativism, all come to a similar place, which is to say, it is a mistake, or at least the debate is: are we able to judge the past by the standards of the present? By the same token, are we willing to be judged by in the future by their rules as opposed to what we do now? So, to take a John Pertwee example, if in 50 years' time we are completely divested of the need to use fossil fuels, are we comfortable with being thought of as dirty and intractable by people for 100 years in the future? The answer is going to be, of course, the answer is, well, some people will always be willing to stand up to that. But we have to understand that we're making the decisions that we make now based on who we are at this particular point. So it's difficult. If you remove relativism or moral relativism or cultural relativism from the table in terms of how to explain things, then it's really quite frightening because there's nothing else to there's almost nothing else to go with. And the only thing that serves, again, having had these discussions with multiple academics, the only thing that they all agree is, in answer to the question, if we abandon moral and cultural relativism, what are we left with as psychological and philosophical tools with which to engage the world? Philosophers say all of philosophy, but everyone else says compassion. You know, how would you treat how do you treat someone who feels differently to you, who operates differently to you? Do you stand there and berate them and say you are wrong, you are completely it's inappropriate to do this, or do you ask them why they made these decisions, and do you listen with compassion and say, well, okay, well, we don't do that now because things have moved on and now we treat people in this way. It's possible to look at the history of the United Kingdom for the last 300 years, and things which were normal at one point are now absolutely not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. But we have to recognize that that is a matter of progress. If I ask someone from the 1650s, why do you do what you do? They will give me very clear reasons why they operate in this particular way. We can take issue with that. We can take issue with the morality of some things that were done. We can take issue with an easy goal, capital punishment. That was something that was for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and it is still now in some societies a feature of human society. But we have got to the point where we don't accept that anymore. We see that it's a very flawed way of dealing with people. And when occasionally voices are raised, it seems to me, when voices are raised in favor of capital punishment, then we listen respectfully because we've learned to listen. But ultimately we say, I don't think this is the way forward. And it takes a lot of compassion and a lot of courage to say that. So bringing it back to Doctor Who, yes, it's possible to, and this is the bit I'll be looking forward to. It's possible to look at classic Who and see and to say, yeah, there's a lot of white people here. There's not a lot of diversity going on here. There's an awful lot of white British middle class values being transported on, being projected onto this central figure who can go anywhere in space and time. And of course, it could be argued that the ability to move through space and time unencumbered is a feature of the white male experience. It's also possible to look at Doctor Who as being a colonialist fable. Here comes the slightly odd professor man into these less developed societies, sprays them with his morality and virtue, makes the judgment, then gets in the box and goes again. But the reality of it is, as I mentioned, it's not a documentary, it's a TV show. And we need to look slightly deeper to get a sense of what is actually happening in Doctor Who. How do we recognize diversity in this particular show? Now, I'm not being an apologist for the fact that it is unashamedly white. Certainly for the first, the first 20 years, it's very white, is Doctor Who. But in that, we can, if we look a little bit deeper, we look and see, well, who directed that first show? Okay, who was the producer of that first show? Okay, fair enough. Verity Lambert is female, but 27 years old, in the middle of doing all this. So, and what is the general trajectory of Doctor Who overall? It is about acceptance. It is about diversity. It's clumsy and it's slow, but to see the amount of well, okay. So I'm a fan, obviously. To see the amount of distance between a character like Toberman or Kemmel so I should explain. This is being listened to by Doctor Who fans, so I don't have to explain. Um, but yeah. So Kemmel, again, Toby, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Kemmel was number one mute,
Yes.
and he was. And it's possible to write the essay to say, okay, so it can be argued that Kemmel represents the black muscle which built the which built the country, and there is, oh, I forget her name, that wonderful the wonderful actress who was using him like a weapon.
Are you to Toberman? Yeah. So Kaftan, named after the apparel, uses Toberman as muscle. Yes, he's not. He does get a couple of lines, but but he doesn't say much. To be fair, and the unfortunate thing with both of those characters, the reason you got them confused, you have a mute black muscle in Evil of the
Yeah.
Daleks, and you have essentially mute black muscle in Tomb of the Cybermen, which, although divided by a season break, are consecutive stories, which, when watched, chronologically, can seem a little, well, shall I say unfortunate? You can say what you can say what you like.
What you've got in that scenario is you've got black actors working on television. We can't underestimate the power of that. Because, as you know, certainly in the 1960s, although there was a black, and when I'm saying black, a coloured presence in media, it was it was limited, extremely limited. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think what's confusing me is that both characters, as you've identified, are very, very similar. They have a very similar role in both of the stories. You know, you are here to move things and to be the threat with which that we present to other people. But that's to miss out. Okay, I'm deferring to you here. I'm thinking Williams from the 10th Planet.
Mm,
And I learned last week when I was doing a bit of research for this that Williams, when it's obvious. Williams was originally written as a Welsh character,
mm,
but there was no reason why he couldn't be Welsh and black. And
yeah.
when we think about Wales, we think about the coastal regions of Wales, and we think about the coast of Liverpool. Of course, these are communities with lots of black people in there.
Although I have to be say, I think that's a slightly fanciful suggestion in that documentary, that because they don't change the dialogue, the inference is that he's a Welshman. I think they're going, we've just changed the character to Earl Cameron, who does incidentally get star billing alongside Robert Beatty as well. So it's not like, so even though he dies in episode 2, he is a prominent piece of casting. I mean, but let's go right back, because I think Marco Polo very
Oh,
interestingly throws up a lot of the issues about how we look at this stuff today. And I will couch, your very concise and helpful explanation of relativism in how, in the relativism of how we of our sort of preoccupations today, which I think are often a need to call out prejudice where we see it,
mm,
but because we know that it happened,
mhm.
and I can be, very cognizant that it shouldn't happen, certainly shouldn't happen now. It probably happened for far too long. Bear in mind that in 1981, when something, less disposable than Doctor Who, the BBC Shakespeare and Historical Project, was being done to capture definitive performances of all of the complete works of our national playwright,
Mm.
the leading black actor cast in the role of the major black role in Shakespeare's canon, Othello, chosen was Anthony Hopkins. So maybe it was the Welsh reclaiming from the 10th Planet's casting. I don't know. But that was in 1981, when you can imagine that actors like Thomas Baptiste and Rudolph Walker were probably waiting for their phone to call and,
Mm.
rightly,
And
appalled at that.
oh,
But by the same token, I think, and maybe this is because it's something about my need to get things right. I am uneasy about the rather casual way that we call something racism when there are all sorts of other factors at play. So let's look at
yeah,
Marco Polo.
yeah.
Marco Polo is directed by a man, an Anglo-Indian director.
Mhm.
a man of colour. What is often missed out in these conversations about Doctor Who is that the co-creator of Doctor Who and the driver behind it is Sidney Newman. Yes, Canadian is one thing. He's also Jewish, which is often an element not brought into these conversations and becomes very important when we look at Marco Polo. Marco Polo used genuine Chinese performers in a lot of the non-speaking roles. That in itself is quite interesting. There's authenticity is therefore seen as important there. It's not seen as important with the speaking parts, although Xenia Merton was certainly, I think, half Burmese, and presents the genuine article and does not require any makeup or augmentation. But then you have the very blonde-haired, blue-eyed Darren Nesbitt as the Mongol warlord Tigana, and then you have in the supporting cast you have Gabor Baraka, who's a Hungarian, Tutti Lemko, who is Norwegian, and Martin Miller, who is Czechoslovakian, all playing the Chinese characters from Kubla Khan to, the bandit via the way station manager. Now, this is interesting for a number of reasons. They do give a Chinese actor lines. Basil Tang, he's one of the support players. He's one of the supporting artists and extra who is given a couple of lines, and he's terrible. Okay. And that sort of answers the question, well, why didn't they just use some of those supporting artists as actors? Because they're not actors. They're supporting artists. They can add authenticity to the background, but bring them to the foreground, and it does bring performance issues, which some might argue is the main concern of any drama, is to be a convincing performance. And we have to bear in mind that there was fewer people to choose from, and I will go on to talk about this later as well. But to provide context for Marco Polo, something that is never discussed when we quite rightly sort of talk about our unease about Yellowface, is that Tutti Lemko, Gabor Baraka, and Martin Miller were all Jewish actors who had escaped the Holocaust, in Baraka's case on foot, having blown up a railway line. These are not part of an elite being gifted things that from a position of comfort. These are all performers welcomed into the generally very welcoming and eclectic theatrical landscape of the United Kingdom, and their casting would then, I would argue, be seen as a progressive move, welcoming foreign nationals into our cultural landscape and giving them the sort of parts. In those days, remember again, we weren't exposed to different voices and accents as much as we are now. And the fact that you've got a Norwegian and a Czechoslovakian and a Hungarian all basically passing as, in inverted commas, foreign, would actually be enough to qualify them to play Chinese, bizarre though that may seem to us. So what I'm saying is that, yes, it looks, in the same way that a special effect looks naive and basic in those times, this approach seems naive and basic and, I'm sure to some, offensive. But give it the context of its time. And instead of it being ignorant, it could actually be, in its own terms, a positive force for at least doing something decent, giving people who've escaped from the Holocaust a chance to establish themselves as performers on British television, even if it's in a way that looks a bit odd to us today. But that is partially because, as well, what I think we sometimes don't talk about when we look at these things is that we have got where we have got because of the work of these people that went before us. And I sometimes think that the speed at which we point the finger at past transgressions doesn't take into account that if any of us, particularly maybe people from my demographic, who would be picked up from 2023 and dropped at the BBC in 1964, would not be sitting there at Television Centre going, no, the first priority of this production is to cast genuine actors of colour in these roles. Because I would argue that anybody from 2023 who casts themselves the hero in that movie is being disingenuous at best and just wrong at worst. Or am I just saying that because I'm a white guy?
I think I can't speak to why you're saying it. I can just confirm that I agree with the sentiment. At that point, yes, there are actors, but are they of the? are they able of are they capable? And so fine, we think of people like Earl Cameron. Okay, there's a wonderful actor who can absolutely do it. But again, you'll know more about this than me, perhaps. But I noticed that there's something very hierarchical about acting, in the same way as there is about music. If you've got the right agent who can get you the right jobs, then you're most of the way there. If, on the other hand, you are not from this environment, you don't necessarily have access to those opportunities, then how are you supposed to get that experience? How are you supposed to get that exposure? And the view I'm taking of this is, okay, from, as you say, the yellow face of Marco Polo, and we can't talk about that without talking about the talons of Weng Chang.
Mm.
How do you? Yeah, and if we're going to go that far, it ain't half hot, mum. The distance between, all right, here is episode 10 of the 10th Planet, or here is Carmen Monroe, or here, better than that, here is what was the character name in The Smugglers? Actually,
Jamaica.
there you go. So so the distance between the sort of performance which passed for acceptable as Jamaica, which is not to do the actor down, he played the part he was given, to this is now the central role, in terms of representation, is really important. Because, okay, Jamaica, The Smugglers is a vaguely historical show, but the representation of black people there is of idiots. Just gabbling. I've never seen it. I've only listened to it, but just this whole it's not a really terribly flattering representation. It might be period accurate. From that to, this is now the pilot of the TARDIS. So Jamaica is now the pilot of the TARDIS. It's well, I mentioned earlier on that that human beings live in the conceit that our lifetimes are vast. They're very, very short. But to see the amount of progress made on this matter in the last 60 years is, if not inspiring, then very, very, very encouraging. This is, and let's not forget, look, the number of the percentage of coloured people in the United Kingdom is something in the region of 12%. It's that these are the demographic facts. But again, to see that the representation of these individuals has moved beyond just light relief or some sort of token walk on to, you are now the show. This is all built around you. It's huge. Similarly, I mean, it's not as if I did hear a story that the Canadians haven't yet seen the Talons of Wang Chang, or it's not been broadcast there, because they come from a place where the Canadians call these First Nations, call their original people the First Nations. It's exactly the right phrase to use, and they are very sensitive to issues of race. And I think it's important to maybe think about, when we say race, what do we mean race? It's really in the minds of most people, when you say race, it's like, okay, black, white, and that's kind of it. Then there might be Chinese, there might be Indian, but it's basically a black and white thing, it seems. If you think of mixed race, you think of someone with a parent of African descent and a parent of European descent. There's our mixed, there's our understanding of mixed race, and that term itself is offensive to many. So I apologise if that's offensive to anyone listening. But I'm mixed race, because my mum comes from an island in the Indian Ocean. My dad comes from West Africa. It's just that they're both black, but I'm still mixed race. In the same way that you yourself, I don't know, but you can have a French mum and a German dad, and you would be mixed race, but you'd still be white before you anything else. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But my point being that race itself as a concept has been acknowledged for well over 30 years by now, as a really blunt tool which does not in any way represent the diversity of humanity.
Well, and if we wanted to, we could say that those people that chased Peter Davison, privileged white actor Peter Davison off Twitter, might be ignoring the fact that his father is Guyanese, and that Peter Davison himself is mixed race. He just doesn't, in inverted commas, look it. Which is fascinating. And so I'm gonna, because I gave a lengthy monologue using the word I a lot, but again, a reminder, I am often adopting a position in order to present a contrary one, or just one that mixes up the argument a little bit, but that does open something up interesting from the other side of the argument I put about Marco Polo, is when we get to the Daleks' master plan.
Oh, good Lord, Kevin Stoney.
Well, there's two things. I mean, I would hold my hands up to probably having double standards as a somebody very liberal who thinks that we should cast authentically and all that sort of thing. I wouldn't want to lose Kevin Stoney's performance just because it's so good, but that's on a very personal aesthetic, judging a performance just completely on its own, divorced of any context. But the intellectual and the person having this discussion, he goes, I should be more uneasy about that for other reasons other than just the quality of a marvellous actor. And perhaps there's part of me that doesn't want to sully that actor's reputation in history because of the ramifications of his casting in that particular role. The other side of it, and this ties in with the issues of disability that I've discussed. I've actually just put in another podcast about when I talked to my partner, who's not sure about whether disabled actors should be cast as visibly disabled parts, or whether it's better, as sometimes happened in the old days, where disabled actors would be cast in a seating position. And it would therefore be hiding the disability. Because in the Daleks' master plan, you have the first and most prominent actor of colour playing a speaking role in Doctor Who, and that is Julian Cherrier, who plays Zephon. You can't tell he's an actor of colour because he's got seaweed for a face. Now, is Doctor Who going, but we're giving an actor of colour a prominent speaking role? This is a good thing. This is progressive. But you're hiding that the fact that he is an actor of colour behind a seaweed carapace, and in the same episode you've got an actor who's essentially wearing yellow face. It's complicated, Tom.
It is complicated, right? And wow, there's a line from La Ruelle des Jeux, The Rules of the Game by Jean Renoir, and it says, "The most terrible thing about people is that everyone has their reasons." So we have to. People do things for reasons that make perfect sense to them, but we can get part way there. So all right, it's Dalek's master plan. So 1965, 66,
both.
Okay, well done, Tom. And we are at the BBC. We are fighting our way out of a corner. We have no budget, and we've got to get this 12-part show made like that. We've got very little resources, and we need people that can learn a script, get the script on Monday, learn it and rehearse it, and record it on the Friday, for the sake of argument. What is available to us? Who has these skills that are available to us? Thing one. Now, of these people who are available to us, how many of them are black? Oh, good Lord, very, very few of them. What do we now do? Because we can't not do the show because we can't find a black actor. We have to, or a black actress. We have to somehow be presenting this picture of the future. And to be honest with you, it's more about, my concern with Mavic Chen is that he's a bit like Spock in that respect, which is to say he represents this kind of fear of Orientalism, and the progress of that, and how let's be clear, Mavic Chen wants to blow up the universe. He's not particular. He's the antagonist in the show. So I'm more concerned about why did he have to be Oriental? Why couldn't he have been from Birmingham or something? But the reality of this is we need good actors who are skilled and experienced very quickly. Where are they? And in a country where there are 12% black people, then acting, as again I'm sure you know, is not necessarily an option for people who come from different demographics. You need to have access to money. And a certain amount of determination in order to be able to keep going at this, because the money's so terrible, and the opportunities are so few and far between, and the entire profession is hopelessly overcrowded. I remember doing a careers talk, or more accurately, being given a careers book to read, and I looked up acting, and it said acting, like music, is one of the most overcrowded professions in the world. And I'm thinking, okay, well that's as much warning as I need for that. And so when you do find an experience, certainly in 1965 and 1966, to find an experienced black television actor would have been, I don't know because I wasn't there, but I'm guessing it was difficult. because television as a medium that doesn't exist that long. The skills necessary to operate with a camera in this small environment are things that people had to learn very quickly. We look at the first wave of television actors. They come from the theatre. They come from a long-established, or at least a very well-established theatrical tradition, which means they can adapt to television. This is not necessarily something that actors of colour had access to. Is that appropriate? Is it a pleasant thing to have to acknowledge? No, it's not. But what we do see over time is that we see that more people of colour have the opportunity, and almost by a process of osmosis, we see suddenly that there are more people with more roles being more prominent. It's a slow thing. I'm not a huge Star Trek fan, but I see a similar thing happening there. And I think I didn't realise I've been quoting you all of these years, which is to say, Star Trek by the generation above me, so my parents' generation, was held up as being something which they really appreciated on many levels, but mostly because there were people of different nations all working together. There was, the mighty Nichelle Nichols. There was Walter Koenig and George Takei. All of this is going on, but I think, and so we can celebrate it on that level. But I think you explained it to me that you can take that view, or it could be that the white guy's in charge, the woman of colour is answering the phone, and the Japanese fella and the Russian fella are driving the car. So it's like, but again, it has to, to me it's this is it. We have to think about when they are and what they're doing. So it seems to me that the work that Doctor Who is doing behind the cameras, as well as on screen, is at least as good as, if not better, than a lot of the cultural landscape at that time. It does require a little bit of digging and a bit of, what's the word I'm looking for? A certain amount of, I won't say concentration, but contemplation to see it for what it is. Is it the same as having an all-black cast? No. But it would have been very difficult to do that. And even when I think of all-black casts in shows that are easily accessible on this in this particular type of television, they're very late. They turn up in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s in any meaningful force. Because before that, you've got things like Mind Your Language, which is entirely about stereotypes. But and again, you'll be able to tell me this, but the character who played I think the Chinese character in Mind Your Language also played the Chinese spy in one of the Pertwee episodes. I can't remember which one it is.
Oh, well, yes, it's The Mind of Evil.
Mind of Evil, thank you. So so that person turns. So in stories which are, not stories, but in productions which are 10 years apart, that person was still being made to play, unfortunately, a stereotype.
Mm. Now, looking at the 60s, I mean, when you talk about Star Trek, Doctor Who tries it in The Wheel in Space, for example, the moon base as well, to have the whole multicultural crew thing, which was a sort of 60s shorthand for going, we're going to imagine a future that is a bit better than ours. And indeed, the director of The Wheel in Space, Tristan Devere Cole, changed some of the characters to make them different ethnicities. So I think Harry Casali becomes Enrico Casali, but he casts Donald Sumter and puts olive makeup on him. He's Italian. He's not blacking up. He's Mediterraneaning up, if you like. But it also but obviously the intent there we would say is laudable. But it also gives way to the actor Peter Laird, who told a colleague of mine many years ago, "Oh yes, I played a lot of Chinese in those days." To give a performance now that, should it turn up, I think would probably be the most offensive to modern eyes, because it's closer to Mickey Rooney than probably certainly anything you get in Marco Polo. But it came from a laudable intent of going, well, we're going to try and have a multi-cultural crew. But we have to be careful, don't we, about how we look at history, because in order to get this right, we have to be honest. And I'm moved to observe that very recently there was a round of applause given to the statement that it was inexcusable casting Caucasian actors in The Abominable Snowmen, which it can be read, I think, as a slur on the director of the time, saying he was indulging in, lazy racism, which I think is an accusation dangerous to waft around against somebody that has no right of reply. But also, I have the edition of Spotlight closest to the production of The Abominable Snowmen in my house, and I've spent this morning looking through it, and I mean, I don't think there were any Tibetan actors, as far as I'm aware. Taking away the fact that it took me all day to go through it, which frankly productions didn't have. It's laborious, but there's no computers, there's no cross-referencing. You tended to use agents that you knew were reliable, who had actors who could do the job, irrespective of sometimes what they look like. But also looking at this, of the 600, I just looked through one edition, A to L, the first half. 1,662 actors in that edition of Spotlight. I think now it's a very difficult thing to say, but actors of colour, so I'm talking about different nationalities now, 38, but those I would confidently say were black actors. Say now I was looking for a black actor in 1968, out of those 662 actors in that edition of Spotlight, 24 are black actors. That's 1.4%. Now, so that's the acting profession. But actually, in terms of if we talk about representation, that is not actually a bad representation of Great Britain at that time in terms of the ethnic makeup of the whole country.
This is the point, and this is the point I made earlier on. The black population is something around 12% at this point. So if we do it statistically, that would be right. If we think about the average person's experience in well, again, it depends on where you live, doesn't it? I mean, if you live in Pittsmore, or if you live in Chapeltown, or you live in Liverpool, then you are more likely to see a person of colour in those areas, because historically that's where those communities are where they wind up. So, maybe Bradford as well, textile areas. But if you live in Midsummer, for example, then okay, the chances that you're going to see a black person are very, very low. And so any opportunity to give weight to the counter narrative of othering is to be welcome. To my mind, is to be welcomed. You mentioned that I don't want to go backward, but you mentioned that when you're growing up, you weren't that aware of a black presence in your community, and that's similarly mine. I sound like this because I had the benefit of a certain type of education. But if you look at the school photographs from when I was at school, there'll be something like 650 boys, and it's where's Tom? There. It's just immediately there he is. As I grow up through the school, there are more and more people of colour in the years below me. But again, it's always going to be a work in progress. So okay, so maybe the argument that's being made there is, okay, well, look, it is a very white show in its early days, but then it's a very white country in its early days. Yes, that's all very true. The BBC was at that point, it's a very white organisation, but it does the most dangerous thing that art can do, which is it foments change. It begins to provide alternative identities, or more, if not alternative identities, it starts to provide visibility of black people. And if Star Trek is thinking about the 30th century, whenever it is, or 25th century, and here's Nichelle Nichols, and she's the communications specialist. If we're getting to when we're looking at the 10th planet, it's 1986, and there's a black astronaut. Beautiful. They got it nearly right. I mean, what would be wonderful would be to see if Doctor Who ever talked about a black president, which I don't think they did, but that would be good too.
I think you'll find. I think you'll find. I think you'll find.
Tom wanted me to point out, so he thinks you'll find, he said that black people are 11 to 12% of the UK population. That's incorrect, he tells me. 11 to 12% is the percentage of non-white people in the UK. Black people, i.e. black like me, says Tom, are closer to 1 to 2% of the total population. But look, I'm not going to go through all of the podcaster chop stuff like that out. I want this to have the flow of the conversation that it was It's not a scientific analysis, this. It's a sprawling chat of thought and insight and postulation. And it's also a conversation of so much that could have been said, but wasn't. Jamaica, well, if he's a stereotype, he's not the only one. Pike is as well. The Smugglers is chock-a-block with stereotypes, as it is something of a pastiche. But then, Jamaica being a stereotype, is that different? And if so, how and why? Captain Chin Lee in The Mind of Evil. Yeah, stereotype, well, maybe, but one written by the husband of the actress who played her. So he hardly had racist intent. He married her. We didn't. We don't address those thoughts that I've just come up with there in the next episode. They're all left hanging. That's the nature of these conversations. As I say, it was a discussion. And despite my promise not to say too much, I note that my Marco Polo monologue does go on forever. But there are arguments and contextualizations and qualifications that need chipping in when discussing this stuff. And probably, on my part for sure, a few elongated stutters where I try to express things in a way that can't be misinterpreted. And I suppose I'm keen to address my observation that a lot of modern commentators seem to want to scold others into empathy, which I think is a flawed plan. And so I felt the need to address suggestions of racism on behalf of people who aren't able to defend themselves from it in this conversation. Anyway, it's not over yet, this chat. It continues in the next episode when we consider the new series, Attitude to Representation, as well as things like A Black Anne Boleyn and colourblind casting in the theatre. I hope you'll find that it's all rather interesting. Thank you for listening to Indefinable Magic, Time and Race, Part 1. Part 2, a continuation of this conversation, will be out shortly. It was presented by me, Toby Haydock, and my special guest is Professor Tom Attah, who can be found at Dr. T. Attah, A-T-T-A-H, on Twitter. The artwork for these podcasts is by Dylan Patterson. And the music for Indefinable Magic is a special composition courtesy of Dominic Glynn. I'm very grateful to the patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Ruben Herfindahl, Stephen Moffat, Peter Burns, James Curray Smith, Peter Harness, Ronald Hayden, Rob Leonard, Christopher Meredith, Richard Straw, Neil Tate, Nick Tedston, Tim Arding, David, you're anonymous, but that's only because I only have your first name. I know what your surname is, but it didn't show when you registered, so I've erred on the side of caution. Nigel Bromley, Jenny at Blue Box 99, Paul Cook, Richard Chalk, Grant Davidson, John Deere, Chris Dunford-Kelk, Paul Dunn, Jason Gorman, Siobhan Galichon, Chris Hyam, Ian Key, Joe Llewellyn, Ian K. McLachlan, Gavin McLean, Philip Marsh, Nathan Martin, Roland Moore, Kevin Murdoch, Graham Knott, Adam Parker, Barry Platt, Risto Matti Sarillo, Frank Shales, and David Trainier. If you would like to become a patron, you can do so at patreon.com/Toby Haydock. You can also donate at kofi.com/Toby Haydock. That gives you no obligations, you're not tied into anything. Whereas you are on Patreon, although you can cancel at any time. And Patreon also gives you bonus materials, advanced releases, and special access, which sounds fruitier than it is. Patreon.com/Toby Haydock is a way of supporting the stuff that I do, and you do get bonuses as well. Everything is available at the lowest possible tier, which is £3 a month. Any tier has 10% taken off it if you sign up for a year in one go. But I also know that times are tough, and you can support these without doing so financially by giving them 5 stars wherever you get your podcasts from, and for saying nice things about them on social media. Please like and subscribe and spread the word. If you have any comments about this particular podcast, I probably won't indulging in back and forths on Twitter. because it can ruin your day. It can distract you too much. I'm trying to write a book. But I'm not immune to the idea that this requires further discussion. So you can email me, haydoketowers@gmail.com, and I might follow up either on my own or with Tom if this has prompted further thoughts. As ever, I would request that any feedback is sent with the understanding that there's a human being trying to do their best, opening up that inbox, and we speak to each other in a way that reflects that.